As we look live at the summit setting, this hour, Prime Minister Mark Carney is holding meetings with NATO chief Mark Rutte, and then Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will bring you those live once they get underway. Now, the leaders are expected to discuss the situation in Ukraine and ongoing military support for the country. The talks follow overnight missiles and drone strikes launched by Russia on Kiev, and it's believed to be the deadliest attack on the capital this year. And the CBC's Janice McGregor is part of our news team covering this summit for us. She joins us now live from Banff, Alberta. Hello, Janice. So it's been another busy day, or it's the start of another busy day. What can you tell us about meetings taking place?
Yeah, quite the context for the conversations on Ukraine today. As you say, Mark Carney's first agenda items are these bilateral conversations, first with NATO Secretary General and then with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The urgency of this conversation between G7 leaders on Ukraine, obviously self-evident with the new facts on the ground overnight. But the intended headline from Canada's side for this morning was to have been how Canada intends to spend the additional $2 billion it's expected to announce in additional support for Ukraine this year. Of course, this part of the ramping up of defense and military spending that Canada announced and committed to, part of its attempt to get at that NATO target of 2% of GDP spending sooner than it was originally tracking, an attempt to sort of bolster its status in the alliance ahead of the NATO summit next week, also a key Canada-Europe summit next week, where Canada's investment in the fight in Ukraine was to be stepping up with these partners. The conversation, though, around the G7 table, obviously very different today without Donald Trump than it would have been if he was in the room. Indeed, we had those extraordinary conversations that we listened to together yesterday, Arthi, with Donald Trump berating the other leaders of the G7 for the fact that Vladimir Putin doesn't sit among them at the table and that he was offended by this. And isn't it a good thing, Donald Trump said, that I am still in touch with him? And sort of, if he was still with us, Putin, we may not have had this war in Ukraine. That still the message from the U.S. president, needless to say, particularly the European leaders around the table with Mark Carney today, do not feel this way, will not be messaging in that direction. So I suppose you could see the room today as a bit less tense without Donald Trump in it, but the response, the effectiveness of anything they might say or do on Ukraine, perhaps weaker without the Americans as part of it inside the tent on that. So a very different morning, perhaps, than what might have been anticipated otherwise. But the first of a number of changes, really, following Donald Trump's departure. Of course, that affects the expanded conversations that we're looking to have this afternoon as well. Those energy security conversations, that sort of extraordinary kind of 2 hours featuring people who have flown in from South Africa, Australia, Brazil, and of course, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. You'd wonder why come in for just 2 hours of expanded sort of talks. Well, probably because they wanted that FaceTime with Donald Trump. They will not be getting it. How that plays out, how that also influences key bilateral talks that are happening very late in the day between Carney and a couple of people that he will have perhaps more difficult conversations with. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, for one, in a similar difficult boat as far as North American relationships are concerned, but someone with whom there are maybe some fences to mend after recent comments by some in Canada about abandoning Mexico in the wake of the need to sort of change the relationship with Trump. And then, of course, something that has caused a lot of protests here in Alberta, Narendra Modi's attendance.
And Janice, I just want to bring our viewers to the attention of their screens, because the Prime Minister is meeting right now with Mark Rutte. And so I wanted to watch that. We know that, of course, the bilateral with the Secretary General of NATO is happening, as you mentioned, in Kananaskis. So that greeting just just took place right now as they will begin those talks. Important, of course, given what is happening around the world, particularly when we're talking about the situation in Ukraine involving Russia. But I do also want to talk about what else has developed at the G7, because important to note that perhaps a little bit of relief for Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, because he was able to speak with Donald Trump yesterday before Trump took off ahead of schedule. And it sounded like they maybe made some progress with a potential deal 30 days away, at least a deadline, which is a commitment of sorts. But his comments, the U.S. president's comments on Air Force One overnight seem to be somewhat contradictory to the tone that we heard during those bilateral talks. Let's discuss that.
Yeah, look, this isn't quite akin to what happened the last time Canada hosts in Charlevoix. It's not clear that there was necessarily kind of any anger. We saw sort of the atmosphere around that closing family photo when Trump was leaving, and he talked about what a good summit had been, how productive it was, that he sort of, regretted having to leave, but he sort of had this other urgent business in the wake of sort of, the kind of moment in the Iran-Israel confrontation that he needed to get back to Washington to engage in. Contrast that, though, with sort of this tape on Air Force One overnight. In particular, think about this tape in the context of what Canada believed it had achieved here in its bilateral conversation with Trump, what was framed as perhaps an acceleration of progress they were making towards having a deal where tariffs would be lifted in exchange for this new economic and security partnership that Prime Minister Mark Carney has been pitching to Donald Trump. Keep that in mind as you hear how Donald Trump answered this question on Air Force One late last night.
I think it's a much better deal from Canada, but it's up to them. They're going to have to pay a lot of tariffs and things. They're going to have to pay a lot of money for the dome, for the Iron Dome. They want to be a part of it. We may make a separate deal on that, by the way. We discussed that, with the dome. That may be a separate deal. They want to be at $71 billion. They're going to pay.
There could be a dome thing separate from the tariff.
They'll be in the dome. Yeah, they'll be under the dome.
So he's now musing about sort of a separate deal where Canada kind of buys itself protection under this new Golden Dome, he should be saying, not Iron Dome, scheme that he's pitching. This is not the same thing as sort of easing back on tariffs. Trump went on to talk about how great all the tariff revenue is that has been rolling into the U.S. and how it will be even more and the more his tariff policy continues and escalates. This, of course, now in the cold light of day, is something that we are chasing response of Canadian officials. Haven't heard anything yet on that. And also,
sorry to interrupt you, Janice. We understand that Mark Rutte and the Prime Minister are speaking right now. Let's quickly listen into that.
First today, an important meeting this morning here in Canada and in this G7, which you are chairing, I think, in an exemplary way. I really thank you for doing this and the leadership you provide. I also want to say that the fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic. And with Portugal having announced the 2% this year last week, that means that the whole of NATO will now be in 2025 at 2% before the summit starts next week in The Hague. So that is really great news. And your leadership here has been extremely important. And we know each other for so many years. So I really look forward to continue working together in whatever role you and I have. It's always great fun and it is always great content. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
No, sorry.
Okay, so we were listening there to Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was speaking with the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. And of course, they're having bilateral talks today at the G7 summit. I do also want to thank my colleague Janice McGregor, who I had to interrupt in order to get to that so we could listen into a little bit of their conversation. And we will get back to Janice later on during the course of the program. But I do want to bring in now John Manley. He's a former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister, and he's now chair of Jefferies Securities. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Morning, Arthi. Thank you.
Okay, so I just actually want to start with what we were watching there, and that is this bilateral that's happening right now between Canada's Prime Minister and the NATO Secretary General. This comes on the heels, of course, of Canada announcing that it will be increasing its defense spending to 2%, which had been the target for NATO previously. How do you think these conversations will be going, particularly in the context of what we're watching happening in Ukraine?
Well, I think, first of all, we are just weeks away from the NATO summit, which will follow later this month, where NATO countries are probably going to raise that target from 2% to something higher, eventually reaching 5%. So I think that Mark Carney took a lot of pressure off Canada by indicating the achievement of the 2% existing target this year. But there's going to be more to come, and there's going to be a need to align Canadian political interests with the international pressure to reach this higher target, given the increased security risks that we're all facing.
And, you know, Mr. Manley, it's likely no secret, of course, that a big sort of, highlight of the talks or of the summit was the presence of the U.S. President Donald Trump, and he is now gone. So many of the leaders who may have traveled there with the priority in their mind to get some time alone with the U.S. President, they won't have that. That said, Prime Minister Mark Carney did have his bilateral with the U.S. President. What did you make of what came out of that? The tone we saw during the course of their bilateral talks when they did speak with media, and a 30-day deadline to reach some sort of agreement on tariffs, contrasted by his remarks on Air Force One, where he was back to that tariff talk and encouraging again of Canada becoming part of the United States.
Well, first of all, if I were the Canadian officials, I would do exactly what they've done, which is don't comment on it at all. In fact, ignore it. It's Donald Trump doing his own personal self-impersonation. This is what he does. This is how he negotiates. I think what happened behind closed doors is more important. He wants to get a deal. He needs to announce some deals. And he needs to describe them as he did the USMCA, which he summarily breached, by the way, on January 20th. He'll describe whatever the deal is as the best deal ever. So I'd say stay tuned, do the hard work. There are a bunch of things that are going to be mixed into this package, some of which will definitely be harder for Canada than other things. The United States will be looking for some movement on some of our dairy policies, probably on the digital services tax, more commitments on defense spending and security, cooperation on security. And we're going to be looking for things from them too. We're going to be wanting to see those steel and aluminum tariffs come down, and the sector-specific targets on autos come off, so that we've got some certainty around what we can say in order to attract investment to our country. There's a lot at stake here. What he says on the airplane, I'd just put it in parentheses and move on.
And to that end, though, in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, how much repair work is happening behind the scenes when we see his departure from this summit versus what we saw in Charlevoix, where, of course, after he departed, he called our Prime Minister at that time dishonest and weak. And this time he did say, I loved it. I tell you, I loved it, talking positively about the summit. So how much work is going on behind the scenes to ensure that this was the outcome?
Well, I think your viewers will know my views of Donald Trump. So I admire the fact that Mark Carney can keep his breakfast down through a meeting with Donald Trump. But I'd also say the relationship is too important. It transcends the individuals in office at any given time. Donald Trump's a special case. I think that Justin Trudeau, I don't know, I think he triggered Donald Trump's bullying reflex somehow. And we got that kind of reaction after the Charlevoix summit. And it wasn't just Justin Trudeau. You remember the famous photograph with Angela Merkel glowering down at Donald Trump and the other leaders sort of standing around him, and I think he felt cornered there. I think the world has adjusted to him to some degree. They know that he's a narcissist and that he will continue to behave the way he behaves, and they kind of endure that in order to get the more important things done, which everyone has at stake in this. But Canada and Mexico are unique in the relationship. We are the only countries that had a trade agreement with the United States, one that was signed with Donald Trump's administration. We're in a different category than everybody else, and we mustn't give up what we earned in that negotiation too easily.
You know, you raise Mexico, and that's an important part of this conversation because we know that the invitation was extended to Mexico's president, who was initially non-committal, then decided to come, and certainly had hoped to have a conversation with the U.S. president, but now will certainly also have a conversation with Canada's prime minister. How important are those talks, and what might come from them?
I think in this negotiation that's going to be ongoing with the United States, Canada needs to align with Mexico. We need to, last time it got a little bit frayed around the edges. The Mexicans were on the verge of doing a bilateral deal with the United States that excluded Canada. Canadian officials led by Ambassador David McNaughton, who at the time was ably assisted, I'd say, by Kristen Hillman, who's the current ambassador, so she knows the ropes on this. I think we nearly had a very bad outcome in 2018. So I think this time it's going to be very important to stay aligned. I think the Mexican president has shown great restraint in her dealings with Donald Trump. Just for example, enduring the embarrassment of him declaring that the Gulf of Mexico was now the Gulf of America. She's shown restraint, she's shown calm, she's shown resolve, and I think for Mark Carney to be and her to be in alignment would be very useful in the ongoing negotiations.
And very finally, Mr. Manley, I did want to ask you about some of the other attendees to the summit, and in particular, India's Prime Minister. There had been some controversy around his invitation, but how critical might the meeting between him and Mark Carney be in order to normalize relations between these two countries?
Oh, look, I think it's very important, and this is a very welcome signal from Mark Carney. Look, if we're going to try to run on a two-track strategy, which seems to be what the government is doing, on the one hand, let's get a trade agreement in place with the United States that's reasonable and acceptable and gives Canada and Mexico preferential access to the U.S. market. On the other hand, let's diversify our trade. Let's trade with other countries in bigger volumes. You know, the next biggest economies in the world include China and India. If we don't figure out how to trade with them, then the diversification strategy is worth nothing. So, renewing relationships with India, getting back on track with India, as former diplomat Colin Robertson entitled a piece last week. We used to say the world needs more Canada. Canada needs more world.
Mr. Manley, I want to thank you so much for your thoughts on the G7 summit. That is John Manley. He is a former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. And we know that the U.S. president left the G7 summit early because he says he wanted to deal with the situation in the Middle East. So now let's turn to the latest on the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Israel's military appears to be signaling there will be no let-up on its airstrikes on Iran. It's claiming its ferocity has Iran's military leadership, quote, on the run. However, senior Iranian commanders dispute that claim, insisting they will keep hitting back at Israel. This video from Tel Aviv shows Israeli air defenses firing at another wave of incoming Iranian missiles. Israel's military says Iran has fired more than 400 ballistic missiles since the conflict escalated on Friday, the number reportedly falling off in recent days because Israeli airstrikes are targeting Iranian launchers. So for more on all this, let's bring in CBC's News senior international correspondent Margaret Evans. She's tracking the latest developments from Jerusalem. Margaret, what are you seeing where you are?
Well, certainly, Arthi, the missiles are still going in both directions. We had air raid sirens sounding again this morning here in Jerusalem and in other parts of Israel, warning Israelis to get to their shelters if they can. As you were saying, Israel is claiming great gains in Iran. They say they've now destroyed a third of Iran's ballistic missile launchers. They're also claiming complete aerial superiority in the skies above Tehran. What we're also hearing are continued hints about the possibility of regime change. For instance, this morning, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, was warning the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, to be careful or find himself following in the footsteps of the former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. We also saw the Israeli foreign minister out and about visiting a site of an Iranian missile that had hit, and he was talking to reporters, and they asked him about whether or not Israel is actively pursuing regime change in Iran. Have a listen to what he had to say.
The Iranian regime is targeting civilians. They are targeting civilians while we are targeting to prevent a huge threat, first of all to Israel's existence, but also to the region as a whole, to Europe, to world order.
He also compared it to fighting an octopus, cutting off the hands of the octopus, and me referring in that sense to Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas. And now he said they're going after the head of the octopus, but he continued to insist that doesn't mean they're going for deliberate regime change. He says it might be the outcome of what's happening. Not everybody in Israel agrees with that. Certainly, most Israelis will tell you they believe Iran is an existential threat to their country. Not everybody agrees that what's happening now is the best way to go about it, especially if it does mean regime change or a deliberate regime change. I spoke this morning with Yair Galon. He is an opposition leader on the left here. He too was out visiting the site of an Iranian missile site, and I asked him for his thoughts. Have a listen to our conversation.
We have a very clear mission to diminish the nuclear military capability of Iran. This is the most important issue concerning the existence of Israel, and this is something we need to make sure will be, in a better future for the region.
Is it a distraction then that the Prime Minister keeps mentioning regime change?
I think it's totally unnecessary, but as you know, I do not support this government. I think that this government is very problematic concerning the cohesiveness of the Israeli society, and therefore I think we need to replace this government as soon as possible.
Now, that's a reminder of the internal domestic politics here in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu is a wartime leader. He is hugely unpopular. We still have the war taking place not far from where I'm standing in Gaza. More than 50,000 Palestinians have been killed. They are still struggling to get aid in, and there are domestic issues with a very hard-right government here, the most hard-right government in Israel's history. So that's a reminder that some of these other issues that are taking place right now, we're talking about what's happening between Iran and Israel because it's so big, it's so important, but there are many other issues taking place as well that are being overlooked for the moment.
And certainly with this conflict intensifying, we've seen, Margaret, U.S. and Israeli leaders have urged people in Tehran to leave. What sort of reaction are we seeing to that warning?
I think you can imagine people would be pretty concerned about it. They will have been witnessing some of these conflicts that the whole world has been witnessing over the past year. We've seen the destruction in Gaza. We've seen what's happened in Lebanon. And there's fear that we're being told that there is a lot coming their way and they should, for their own survival, get out of town. obviously that's going to spark fear. This is a tactic that the military, the Israeli military, has used for in Lebanon and in Gaza, warning populations, saying, we're coming in, you could be close to a target, for your own safety going. I was speaking via text with someone I know in Tehran yesterday. I mean, Tehran is a city of nearly 10 million people. Imagine that many people trying to get out of town. Not everybody can or will try to, but there are huge traffic jams. I was asking my friend, you know, are you going to plan to leave to meet your family in another city, in another part, a safer part of Iran? And he said he wanted to, but he said he had half a tank of fuel in his gas tank and that he couldn't afford to fill it up with much more. And even if he had the money to go, he couldn't go very far with one gas tank because of fuel shortages and because of these huge lineups at the gas station. So a lot of chaos, a lot of fear, as you might have, you know, the Israeli and the American leaders saying, get out of town. A lot of people won't be able to, but it will also make a lot of people angry. And so when Israel is talking about potential regime change, what some of the analysts would tell you is that it could have the opposite effects. It could have people rallying around the flag because their lives and their livelihoods are being threatened. One of the targets that was hit yesterday was the state broadcaster. We saw it, you know, hit live on air. That's in a residential area. People, you know, it's landing right in the middle of their neighborhoods. Might be a military target. We don't know. But obviously, for ordinary people, this is a really uncertain time.
Thanks for the latest, Margaret. That is the CBC's senior international correspondent, Margaret Evans, in Jerusalem. Now, meanwhile, in Gaza, health officials say at least 51 people were killed today in the southern city of Khan Yunis as they waited for trucks carrying desperately needed aid. We know that more than 200 other people are said to have been injured. Witnesses tell the Associated Press that Israeli forces carried out an airstrike on a nearby home before firing on the crowd. Israel's military hasn't commented on this incident yet, but it's just the latest of several that have happened in recent weeks at food distribution points run by a U.S. and Israeli-backed group. Now, as we mentioned, right now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is meeting with NATO Secretary General, and later he will be meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. That will happen this hour on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Alberta. Those talks happening just hours after Russia launched a barrage of drones and missiles on Kiev. It's believed to be the deadliest attack on the Ukrainian capital in nearly a year. So now this video shows the aftermath. Ukrainian officials say at least 16 people have been killed and more than 100 wounded. Dozens of civilian targets were hit, including an apartment block. The CBC's Brar Stewart is in our London bureau tracking all of the details. So, Brar, what more can you tell us about these latest strikes?
Well, this is really part of a disturbing trend of Russia really increasing the number of drones that it's targeting Ukraine with in an attempt to overwhelm its missile defense systems. And in terms of the drones last night, more than 440 drones and 32 missiles. And from the images and video out there, and certainly the reports, I mean, you can see the damage that has been caused. One ballistic missile slammed into a 9-story apartment building, and rescuers are still picking through the rubble because they believe that people are buried underneath. It's a very, devastating attack for people. And you have Russia's defense ministry saying that these were precise military strikes. Certainly, when you look at the images, you see cars, you see residential streets, and no clear military targets. And also, you have the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko. We have a piece of video from him that he posted online. And if you look at it, you can see that he has, there are balls on the ground, and he says that these are cluster munitions. So these are things that are packed in to a missile, and they're designed to spread over a large area and cause even more damage. So this is a very devastating attack on Kiev. It is very possible that the death toll will continue to rise, but this is part of a larger trend we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, where Russia is just sending so many drones, and not only drones, but also decoy drones, ones that aren't laden with explosives, but they send them all in such a big bulk that they tie up and overwhelm the missile defense systems.
So, Briar, also we know the U.S. president left the G7 meeting in Alberta early, and as a result, he missed a planned meeting with Zelenskyy. Where do things stand with that right now, and what are the longer-term prospects for peace?
Well, that was no doubt very disappointing for Ukraine's president because he had hoped to talk to Trump about purchasing weapons. And I think really it is a very difficult situation now for Ukraine because you've had Donald Trump say repeatedly that he might walk away from negotiations or pushing for a ceasefire if Russia isn't interested. And you really don't see Washington bringing any more pressure at all on Russia. There really hasn't been talk of Washington laying any additional sanctions to really pressure Moscow. And at the same time, you have a lot of concern in Kiev about what's going to happen over the next couple of months. We've heard about Russia trying to launch a summer offensive to take a greater swath of Ukraine, not only in the southeast, but in the north as well. I mean, there are tens of thousands of Russian troops who are stationed along the border in the northeast with the region of Sumy. And there are great fears, really, about what will transpire, what could transpire over the next couple of months if Russia decides to try to punch through the front lines across Ukraine.
Briar, thanks for this. That is the CBC's Briar Stewart reporting from London. Well, Global Affairs says thousands of Canadians are stranded in Iran and Israel as a result of the escalating fighting between the two countries. Just ahead, we'll hear more from the people who are trapped in the region. You're watching CBC News Network. Well, there's some good news in Manitoba's wildfire fight. People evacuated from more than a dozen communities across the province have returned home or will be able to do so later on this week. And the CBC's Gavin Axelrod caught up with members of Northern Cree Nation as they prepared to make their way home.
Packing up for the trip home to Pimachikamak Cree Nation. For some, the load was small, others with as much as they could carry. All of these people share the joy of going home.
Tears of joy. Yesterday, me and my kids we had tears of joy, excited to go home. We found out that we were going to go home, and we were just excited.
Thousands were forced out of the northern Manitoba community in late May because of wildfire near the First Nation. David Monias is the chief of Pimachikamak Cree Nation.
Just really elated in terms of I'm very happy to see that. And so you could see the people that came there right away, they came and shook hands and happy hugs and stuff like that. So
there are two wildfires near Pimachikamak. One is more than 2,000 hectares and being held. Another south of the First Nation is over 64,000 hectares in size and considered out of control.
Right now it's not out yet. I mean, we're not out of the woods, but it's safe, and I think we can manage it.
The province says there are 18 wildfires still burning. 7 are out of control.
These are very large fires, and they are not extinguished. They are not out and won't be for some time.
Officials say 22,000 evacuees registered with the Red Cross. About 40 people are in congregate shelter space in Winnipeg, about 150 in Thompson.
Our focus is on returning people home when there's a higher level of confidence that they won't have to leave again soon. But I think we're all mindful of the dynamic nature of this peril of the wildfire itself.
Chief Monias says Pimachikamak's return home plan will happen over several days. A few thousand were expected to head home Monday. The chief says people with breathing issues and medical concerns will likely be the last to return.
We're trying to make it, as quick as possible, but safely.
Happy to go home today. I can't wait to be home at Cross Lake.
And even though it's a long way home, it's a trip McKay and thousands of others are more than happy to make. Gavin Axelrod, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So as many evacuees head home, others are still anxiously watching and waiting for the green light. The mayor of the northern city of Flin Flon is asking members of his community to remain patient. George Fontaine says it may be at least another week before they are allowed back. That's because the wildfire threatening the city is still burning out of control. So far, there are no reports of any structure damage. Many of the people from Flin Flon are currently staying in temporary accommodation in Winnipeg. You're watching CBC News Network. We're back in a moment. We do want to get back to the situation involving Israel and Iran. And we were discussing that there are many who are feeling stranded because Israeli airspace remains closed and outbound flights to other countries remain on hold. Flights out of Iran are also grounded. Yasmin Hanea has more from Canadians who are unable to leave Israel and Iran.
It's been probably 20 or 30 times that we've been in and out of shelters, sometimes once every 45 minutes.
Eisenberg is in Israel as part of an international delegation invited by the country's foreign ministry to meet with members of the LGBTQ+ community.
There's a lot of emotions. We understand the concept of the shelters and the concept that we're safe, but at the same time, there is so much that we don't know. We don't know if it's going to hit near us. We don't know how many are coming at us.
With Israeli airspace closed to civilian planes, she says the Canadian embassy has warned her it could be days or weeks before she could get out of the country.
So that was actually more anxiety-inducing in a weird way than any of the rockets have been up to this point.
Iran's airspace is also closed. Toronto resident Sarah Shariati's father is trapped in Tehran.
When the strikes first started, you could hear them while inside the house. And as the attacks are getting more intense and more frequent, he's worried and is unsure of what he should do.
There is no Canadian embassy in Iran. Global Affairs says its ability to provide consular services is extremely limited. It says it has not received any reports of Canadians injured or killed in relation to the escalations in the Middle East. Those who are stranded will continue to shelter in place as necessary and hope the conflict doesn't escalate even further. Yasmin Hanea, CBC News, Vancouver.
The Port of Montreal says it has seen a big surge in shipments to China as a consequence of escalating tensions between Beijing and Washington over trade. Scott Peterson is following the story for us. So, Scott, what is the port saying about diversifying Canada's international trade?
Yeah, it's saying that overall, while our shipments and our exports and imports, for that matter, with the U.S. are down significantly, we are seeing an increase in international trade. And, of course, that's the business of the ports, and they are responsible for shipping everything overseas and importing, for that matter, as well. So this is according to the Montreal Port Authority, and coming out with numbers specifically with China. And despite a lot of trade tariffs back and forth that we've imposed and are imposed on us with China, we're seeing trade with China up 22% over last year. And this is despite China rolling out those tariffs on Canadian pork and canola in retaliation for our tariffs on electric cars. Trade war is also taking a toll. However, overall shipments are down about 2% over this time last year. And Statistics Canada is pointing out that we are seeing shipments, rail shipments in particular, down to the U.S. are down about 16% in April. That has nothing to do with the ports, but the ports point that out, saying that there's more enthusiasm now for international shipping. For example, Spanish volume is up 147%. The shipping to the Netherlands up 11%. Africa 29%. 54% increase with Latin America. And a lot of fruit, aluminum trade, pharmaceutical trade up significantly as well. And again, the Port of Montreal is the largest eastern port that Canada has. It rivals only Vancouver, our #1 port on the West Coast. And they say that trade diversification obviously has to take place in the ports, and they're showing these strong numbers with the international trade, which shows that that diversification is happening, and that is with the woes that we're seeing with U.S. trade and the tariffs down there.
And the tariffs, of course, we've been talking a lot about the uncertainty. People don't really like that new numbers are out of the U.S., and they're talking about consumers pulling back on their spending with those new retail sales numbers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a lot of worry south of the border. We're seeing consumer confidence pull back, a lot of worry about the tariffs and what that means. And so a big pullback in retail spending, 0.9% for the month of May. This makes 2 months in a row. We're seeing a big pullback in car spending or automobiles, building materials, materials, restaurant and bars. So a lot of worry there, again, about retail spending. And that's a big part of the economy. So as a result, let's get to the markets. We're looking at a downward day as well. We're seeing the price of oil spiking up at about $1.50 a barrel. The Canadian dollar, the euro, the British pound, all a little bit negative against the U.S. dollar. And let's get to those markets. They're a little bit too hard to call. There's lots of worry about what's going on in the Middle East, of course, but the TSX down 40 points. The Dow Jones, the S&P, and NASDAQ sort of slightly into negative territory, with the Dow Jones itself down about 86 points. So again, lots of worry about what's going on in the Middle East.
Thanks for this, Scott.
Thanks, Auntie.
Well, Canada's Industry Minister, Mélanie Joly, says aerospace workers in Quebec will benefit from an aircraft deal that was just made in France. Joly is at the Paris International Air Show, which brings together key stakeholders in the aerospace and defense sectors. The deal is between LOT, Polish Airlines, and France's Airbus, which builds its A220 aircraft here in Canada.
Airbus announced 40 new aircraft, plus an option of 44 aircrafts that would be built in Mirabel, Quebec. And so that's good news. Our Canadian ambassador to Poland has been heavily involved in making sure that this deal could happen. We've been working with the French and Polish governments on this issue, and we know that this is a net benefit to all three countries.
Now, Joly says she has also met with several CEOs and European businesses in the defense sector, and she says she told them Canada is ready to make big investments since announcing it will quickly meet its NATO requirement of spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now, stay with us. There's much more straight ahead. You are watching CBC News Network. Hello and welcome inside the CBC Newsroom. I'm Arthi Paul. This hour, critical talks between Canada's Prime Minister and Ukraine's President. It is the final day of the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, and it's moving forward without U.S. President Donald Trump, who departed a day early. He says he had to deal with the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. So now, as we look at the summit setting in Alberta, today Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with NATO Chief Mark Rutte, and any minute now we are expecting bilateral talks between Carney and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to get underway. The leaders will be discussing the war with Russia and ongoing military support for Ukraine. The talks follow overnight missiles and drone strikes launched by Russia on Kiev. It is believed to be the deadliest attack on the capital this year. The CBC's Janice McGregor is part of our news team covering the summit. She joins us now live from Banff, Alberta. So, Janice, there's breaking news this hour. What's the latest?
Yeah, we're expecting the arrival, as you say, of Volodymyr Zelenskyy very shortly. We'll see that kind of greeting by the water there, and then they're going to go in for his bilateral conversation with Prime Minister Mark Carney. And it's that we'll be leaning in on in anticipation of an announcement from the Canadian side. Now, previously, we had been told that this would be the time where we get some specifics on the $2 billion previously earmarked for support for Ukraine and defense partnerships. You remember when the announcement was made about increasing Canada's military and defense spending significantly in this fiscal year to bring Canada more in line with NATO's 2% of GDP spending target. There was this specific kind of pocket of money that was loosely earmarked for Ukraine without having any specifics as to how that would be spent, if this was particularly that there would be purchases made on Ukraine's behalf, or would there be other ways that sort of additional support from Canada's military would be helpful to Ukraine in the short and medium term. If we are talking about spending in this fiscal year, this is not a long-term ramp up to something. This is like an order right now, one presumes. So we're expecting to get some more specifics on something that was previously known only generally, and obviously more powerful to have the Ukrainian president sitting right there with Mark Carney for this. Of course, all of this is somewhat laying track to some pretty significant things we're going to see at another summit coming next week between Canada and the EU, and of course Mark Carney's participation in the summit of the various leaders in the NATO alliance. That is the time when sort of the focus would otherwise have been on Canada as a laggard in defense spending, this initiative to rearm Europe, Canada signaling it is going to step up, provide more support on that as well. These all subjects of this morning's bilateral conversations for the Prime Minister. But they're happening, of course, in a greater context where we talk a lot about the intersection between security and trade now in the wake of Donald Trump's tariff threats, as the tariffs have gone on, straining everyone's economies, including, for example, the steel and aluminum trade in Canada. At the same time, the demands for more spending on security have also gone up. Could these things be related? When you spend on military procurement, can you strengthen your domestic steel and aluminum industry? These are exactly the kind of strategies underway and being thought about in Canada now. Industry Minister Melanie Joly was referencing this when she was taking some questions about where Canada's response to Donald Trump's determination to stick with his tariff threats are going. When reporters were talking to her earlier today, Canada hasn't retaliated yet, instead has said, no, we're going to reposition, get stronger. This military spending, part of that economic plan, but also part of the relationship building that is at the heart of these summits, where people with like-minded, similar values get in a room, talk about their shared priorities and the shared urgency of the cause, which in this case is defending Ukraine, something that you don't have to convince the European leaders of. But Donald Trump needed convincing. It's significant not to have him in the room today because of his departure from the summit yesterday. He, of course, when sitting with Mark Carney yesterday, was talking about how he thinks Putin should be part of these conversations of G7 leaders, sort of holding grudges, raising grievances with the G7's treatment of Russia in the past when it was kicked out following the invasion of Crimea. And of course, it is a very different conversation talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine with Trump in the room because he harbors those views, versus today, which is presumably clearer sailing with just like-minded people all having sort of the same values when it comes to Ukraine.
And of course, Janice, we continue to wait or stand by, rather, for the arrival of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, as he is set to have bilateral talks with Prime Minister Mark Carney at the G7 summit. But we also know that, as you raised, there's that upcoming NATO summit. And earlier today, NATO's Secretary General sat down with our Prime Minister. What did they have to say?
Yeah, let's see a bit of tape of that, and then we'll talk about some of the specifics that he raised.
The fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic. And with Portugal having announced the 2% this year last week, that means that the whole of NATO will now be in 2025 at 2% before the summit starts next week in The Hague. So that is really great news. And your leadership here has been extremely important.
So it's interesting right now, Mark Carney is the chair of this summit, but of course next week NATO Secretary General will be leading those talks in Europe. But good news for NATO that Canada is signaling it will not delay any further, kind of catching up to the 2% target. The challenge, the problem, if you will, for those looking at Canada's books, is that target, at the urging of the Americans and certain European partners as well, is likely to be on the move upwards. So even as Canada is making announcements that get it to this 2% bar, it may be rising to 3.5%, an additional 1.5% on top of that to get to 5%. If you look at sort of related defense investments, Canada just kind of grappling with how it would get there. It's been such a difficult road even to get to 2% in this country.
Janice, thanks for the latest on this. That is the CBC's Janice McGregor reporting from Banff, Alberta. And my next guest is closely following what comes out of the G7 summit about the future of Ukraine. Roland Paris joins us now. He served as foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Currently, he's the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Welcome. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you, Artie.
Okay, so we know that we are standing by waiting for Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to hold their bilateral talks. What do you hope comes out of those discussions?
Well, I think that there's a discussion between Canada and Ukraine, but then there's the larger discussion with the supporters of Ukraine, including the rest of the G7 and some of the other countries that have been invited to this G7 summit. The context is that Vladimir Putin has been accelerating the offensive by Russia in Ukraine, clearly sees an opportunity here to try and take advantage of Trump's ambivalence about supporting Ukraine, wants to achieve more battlefield victories. And so part of the dynamic has been for Europe and Canada and other supporters of Ukraine to really rally together to try to provide Ukraine with additional support, while also trying to lobby the United States, work with President Trump, encourage President Trump to support Ukraine. And so the meeting between Carney and Zelenskyy is just part of that set of meetings that will be taking place later today.
Now, of course, we know that it was really not that long ago we saw the Prime Minister announce a boost in Canada's spending when it comes to defence. And part of that might be that Ottawa has also allocated some funds for Ukraine, for assistance, for military aid. Wondering what that might look like.
Well, I don't know. We'll find out when the announcement is made. This is in the context of the supporters of Ukraine having to really ramp up the kind of assistance that they're providing. Part of the assistance is financial, part of it is in terms of military equipment as well. And, Canada has made an announcement that it's going to significantly boost its military spending, but the Prime Minister has also indicated that he really wants to strengthen the Canadian defense industry in order to support the expansion of our military and also support jobs in Canada. Europe is doing the same thing on an enormous scale, and Canada and Europe, all the indications are going to be cooperating on that. That's for the benefit of Europe, for the benefit of Canada, for the benefit of NATO, but it's also for the benefit of Ukraine, because there are certain pieces of military equipment that the United States is really only providing now, like air defense, and the Europeans and Canada need to be investing in the production of that kind of equipment for their own safety, but also to be able to help Ukraine.
Now, in addition, of course, to the meeting that will be held with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, we know that the Prime Minister is meeting with a number of other non-G7 members. India is one of the countries whose leader was invited to attend, and that is despite some controversy involving, of course, not only some threats or reports involving foreign interference, but also when it comes to the ongoing police investigation involving the killing of a Sikh separatist activist in British Columbia. How do you imagine that conversation might go between these two leaders?
Well, it'll be very interesting to watch the outcome of that. I mean, let's just bear in mind this G7 meeting is actually is many, many different meetings in one venue. You've got the formal G7 sessions with the G7 leaders around the table. Then you have side meetings among those G7 leaders, and we saw Prime Minister Carney meet with the Prime Minister of the UK and announced renewed trade discussions. And you have meetings with these so-called outreach countries, including India. For Carney, this is a very difficult balancing act. On one hand, he wants to be expanding Canada's relationships around the world, particularly now that the one with the United States is less dependable. On the other hand, you have an Indian government that Canadian intelligence agencies have reportedly identified as responsible or partly responsible for a murder of a Canadian citizen in Canada, that U.S. and Canadian intelligence agencies believe was behind orchestrating an assassination campaign in North America. I would very much hope that Mr. Modi is going to be expressing India's support for the investigation of these of this murder in Canada, because if not, it's really unclear why he should have been invited to Canada.
And finally, I wanted to ask you, as someone who was, of course, an advisor for Justin Trudeau, we know that the last G7 summit in Charlevoix ended differently. I want to ask you, as an outside observer now, watching what is taking place now, what are some of your observations or your assessments about how this summit is going so far?
Well, it's a mixed bag, of course. In 2018, the summit ended, and then the immediate aftermath was that Donald Trump got on his airplane and just started, launching broadsides and attempted to remove the U.S. signature from the summit declaration. It ended in rancor. So Donald Trump did leave this G7 summit yesterday evening, but he did not leave it in rancor. Yes, he said some nasty things about Emmanuel Macron, but his stated reason for leaving was the situation in the Middle East, not an eruption. And so the meeting was not disrupted by Donald Trump. He held a series of meetings. I think that Mark Carney did a very good job, a very difficult situation of trying to manage this meeting while also asserting Canada's interests without triggering Trump. And now what we have is a meeting of the rest, which will be interesting too. And it will be also interesting to watch to see whether some of the subject-specific statements or announcements that were planned for the end of day today will go ahead with the United States support, even though Trump isn't there.
Roland, I want to thank you very much for your time and your thoughts on this. That is Roland Paris. He served as a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And we do want to turn now to the issue that led to Donald Trump's early departure from the G7 summit, the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Israel's military appears to be signaling there will be no let-up in its airstrikes on Iran. It's claiming Iran's military leadership is now, quote, on the run. But senior Iranian commanders dispute that claim, insisting they'll keep striking back at Israel. This video from Tel Aviv shows Israeli air defenses firing at another wave of incoming Iranian missiles. Israeli forces estimate Iran has fired more than 400 ballistic missiles since last Friday. We do want to take you now live to Kananaskis, Alberta. As you can see, there is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy arriving to meet with Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney had extended an invitation to Ukraine's leader, of course, amid conflict that is ongoing in that country involving a war launched by Russia in 2022. Allowing you to listen in there for a moment. We know that the Prime Minister and Ukraine's president will be holding bilateral talks following this appearance here. We will wait to see whether or not there is any comment for media ahead of those scheduled talks. But we do know that the Prime Minister is expected to offer more support for Ukraine as well. I know the CBC's Janice McGregor is in Banff, Alberta, and she's standing by to discuss more of what we're expecting from this meeting. Janice.
Yeah, we'll just have a short pause here between the welcome. You're seeing these pictures here. The two leaders are going to go into the room where their bilateral conversation is going to take place, and then we will want to listen in again. Because we believe that might be when we hear some specifics about how Canada is stepping up, exactly what you were just talking with Roland Paris about. We know, even from looking at parliamentary spending estimates, that there is new money earmarked for Ukraine. What we don't know is what they are spending that money on, what the strategy is, what sort of is being offered, how that affects Canadian industries, how this fits into the big picture of what Zelenskyy believes he needs at this stage in the war, which is obviously continuing to evolve. And with the sort of very serious attacks overnight, of course, a very difficult morning for him to be here, but maybe also a good time to be here because he is going to be sitting in a room of allies room of Canadian and European partners, specifically British partner also, that have been signaling their desire to step up in a way that the U.S. Is not in this moment, at a time when the U.S. Is reconsidering and figuring out kind of where it's going to go on this conflict. The need for Europeans to step up if the U.S. is not going to perhaps be a leader in NATO the way it has been in the past, has been more and more a feature of these security conversations, ones that will be on the forefront next week too, but are on the agenda here as well.
And again, Janice, I'll have to interrupt you as we take our viewers to the room where that bilateral will take place. Let's listen in for a moment.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde. C'est un grand honneur d'accueillir Monsieur le Président Zelenskyy d'ici à Kananaskis pour cette réunion très importante du G7. I would like to start by condemning, in the strongest terms, the latest outrage, barbarism from Russia, and express my deep condolences and those of the Canadian people to the families in Kiev who were affected. This underscores the importance of standing in total solidarity with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian people, and we had a discussion last night amongst G7 leaders. The President and I will discuss more, and then of course we'll have the direct discussion in a moment together. But we underscored the importance of using maximum pressure against Russia, who has refused to come to the table. The President has led unconditionally to come to the table in search of peace. And maximum pressure includes financial pressure, and Canada is announcing today several measures, sanctions, first and foremost, against a number of individuals in Russia, against over 40 entities in Russia and beyond that are trying to contribute to the evasion of sanctions, the sanctioning of over 200 vessels in the shadow fleet that Russia is using, again, to try to evade these sanctions. That's the first thing. The second is we are providing additional military assistance, drones, helicopters, broader munitions, over $2 billion worth of assistance directly to Ukraine. And thirdly, we are dispersing the next tranche of the loan based on the frozen Russian assets, over $2 billion as well. This is our contribution. We'll be working with our European and other allies for their contributions to provide the support. And to be absolutely clear, this support will be unwavering until we get a just peace for Ukraine and Ukrainian people.
Thanks so much, dear Prime Minister. First of all, good to be here in Canada, and for the G7 summit, thank you for your invitation. But first of all, thank you for your very important words, warm words, and supporting Ukraine. Of course, condolences to our families. Really, Ukrainians had, our families had, very difficult night. One of the biggest attacks from the very beginning of this war, 440 Shaheeds, Iranian drones, and 32 missiles, including ballistic. And I was on direct connection during the flight with all the ministers and of course with the chief of air defense, and really it was a big attack on civilian infrastructure, on people, just people, houses and etc. And for now, information is not total information, not that final information, but for now we have 138 injured people and 12 killed. And so, yes, it's a big tragedy for us, and we need support from our allies, and I'm here, and thank you for the military package. It's important for our soldiers to be strong at the battlefield, to stay strong until Russia will be ready for the peace negotiations. We are ready for the peace negotiations, unconditional ceasefire. I think it's very important, but for this we need pressure. And of course I want to speak with Prime Minister today about sanctions, additional sanctions, and thanks for the real unwavering support from your side, from all the Canadians to our people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we had been listening there to Ukraine's president along with Prime Minister Mark Carney as they were discussing, of course, what we saw overnight. We saw that in terms of an attack, there was the killing of 12 individuals and 100 were injured. We heard that from Ukraine's president in an overnight attack by Russia. The Prime Minister condemned that attack as he also announced some actions that will be taken. He announced, of course, that there will be maximum pressure sanctions against 40 entities in Russia, as well as 200 vessels in the shadow fleet. Along with that, some additional, as we had been discussing, military support to the tune of $2 billion worth of support in a variety of ways, and also the dispersing of what can be of frozen assets as well. I want to bring in the CBC's Janice McGregor now to discuss a little bit more about what we heard between these two leaders, talking about maximum pressure, that is something that leaders at the G7 summit talked about, a very different tone from what we heard in that office yesterday, where we had the U.S. president saying Russia should have been invited there. But we heard Mark Carney today condemning the actions of Russia and saying that it underscores the importance of making sure that leaders stand in solidarity with Ukraine.
Yeah, and certainly strong language and solidarity will be easier, perhaps, at this gathering without Donald Trump in the room. I think we need to unpack in a bit more detail the nature of this additional support for Ukraine, because it kind of came out really quickly in that newser. I know a little bit more and can explain it a little bit more. Let's start with the sanctions first. So Canada has already sanctioned a very long list of Russian and also Belarusian officials going back years, even sort of to Crimea invasion days. It keeps adding to it for new reasons and in new ways. Specifically here, as you say, they are targeting the 20 vessels in the shadow fleet, marine vessels, and also energy revenues, a focus of what they're going after here. An issue with the sanctions list as it has been, though, is, of course, that only kind of applies if someone's trying to come to Canada or if they already have assets in Canada. That doesn't always apply to all the names on that list. Sometimes a bit more symbolic a message than something tangible in terms of sort of seizing revenue or being able to help Ukraine financially. Now, the message from Carney about asset seizures, people might remember there are a few frozen assets, not anywhere sort of in the billions and billions of dollars, but there's one particular one that has been kind of finally progressing in the courts this spring after sort of sitting on the tarmac at Pearson Airport. They have finally filed the court paperwork to seize and perhaps eventually turn over proceeds to Ukraine for that Russian cargo jet that Canada took steps like going back to 2022 to sort of seize. So that is underway. The second piece, the new procurement, the things they've listed as purchasing with this are drones, ammunition, which of course Ukraine goes through a lot of. Canada hasn't always made a lot of domestically, but those conversations changing. Light armored vehicles, those are made in Canada. We watch to see if there's more forthcoming perhaps from General Dynamics in London, its facility there, about what it means for them in terms of business and also using Canadian steel for those. So that piece, we're waiting for some new numbers on. And then finally, the $2.3 billion loan to Ukraine to help rebuild its infrastructure and public systems. Canada has been doing a lot to support Ukraine financially, underwriting a lot of financing to keep its government afloat through this war, going back to the very start. This additional spending was accounted for in the supplementary estimates that I believe cleared Parliament just last night, if my tracking in Ottawa is correct. I'll also just tell you politically, Anita Anand, the Foreign Affairs Minister, in the room for this bilat. We are expecting to hear a bit more from her, hopefully, as the day goes on. She's been having conversations with her counterparts based in Calgary. So far this week, this is her first day at the summit proper as Foreign Affairs Minister. And so we'll see what else she has gleaned from her specific colleagues on top of what is happening in the room with the main leaders.
Thanks for those details. That is the CBC's Janice McGregor in Banff, Alberta. This is a live look at the White House. U.S. President Donald Trump says he will be in the Situation Room today. He left the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, early. Trump told reporters on Air Force One last night that he wants more than a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and Iran. And the CBC's Karen Pauls joins us now live from Washington with more. So, Karen, there are some mixed messages about why Trump left the G7 early. There's some suggestions U.S. officials could be meeting with Iran, but then Trump also said on social media that residents of Tehran should evacuate immediately. So is there any clarity on what's happening?
You know, Arthur, it really did feel like there was something urgent in the air when Donald Trump said yesterday that the conflict in the Middle East was forcing him to return here to Washington as soon as he could, especially when he put up that post warning people living in Tehran to get out, creating some panic, bumper-to-bumper traffic. And then on the way back to Washington on Air Force One, reporters tried to get some clarity on reports that he might be sending U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and maybe even Vice President J.D. Vance to meet with Iranian foreign minister this week. Take a listen to some of that exchange.
There's reports that you want to send the Vice President and Steve Witkoff to meet with the Iranians and have discussions. Is that something you're considering?
Not sure yet. I may. Depends on what happens when I get back.
What specifically is better than a ceasefire? What are you looking for here?
An end. A real end, not a ceasefire. An end.
So something that would be permanent?
Yeah, or giving up entirely. That's okay too.
Are you close there? Is that possible in the next 24 hours?
Certainly possible.
Certainly possible, but then early this morning, Trump posted something that seems a little contradictory, saying on social media, "I have not reached out to Iran for peace talks in any way, shape, or form. This is just more highly fabricated fake news. If they want to talk, they know how to reach me. They should have taken the deal that was on the table, would have saved a lot of lives." So, Arthi, some confusion about what exactly he has in mind.
And Karen, we're also hearing, and we were reporting that there's a Situation Room meeting today in Washington where Trump will be conferring with his national security staff there. What more do we know about that?
Right. Well, analysts say the U.S. basically has three options. The first one, wait and see what happens. This is none of our business. It's not our war. Trump's administration has already told Israel officially that the U.S. won't be a partner in military strikes against Iran's nuclear sites. Last night, that message was reinforced. A White House spokesman posted on X saying American forces are maintaining their defensive posture, and that has not changed. We will defend American interests. So then the second option is de-escalation through diplomacy. Make Iran an offer, a nuclear deal, an end to the war with Israel, basically giving them a face-saving off-ramp. And, you know, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said today there's no doubt in his mind that Trump is serious about de-escalation. You know, analysts are saying that this is an effort by Trump to move away from war and back towards making deals. And if there are any meetings this week, depending on the outcome, it could tip the scales on whether the U.S. will join the conflict, which brings us to that third option. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants Trump to get actively involved in this war. He doesn't believe diplomacy can solve what he sees as an existential threat. Analysts say Israel doesn't have a weapon capable of taking out Iran's nuclear site, but the U.S. does. And of course, a direct intervention would be a very big move. So, Arthi, those options are on the table in the Situation Room today as the president meets with his national security advisors. Those conversations are top secret, but hopefully there will be some clarity on what Trump is prepared to do.
Thanks for the latest on this, Karen. That's the CBC's Karen Pauls in Washington. So now for more on this story, we've reached Daniel Shapiro in Washington. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Israel and most recently served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Currently, he's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So I want to pick up on the last point that we were hearing from our reporter in Washington, and it's the question of whether or not Washington should get involved in this conflict between Israel and Iran.
I think the decision facing President Trump is more or less as follows. it's very much in the United States' interest that at the end of this war, Iran does not have the capability to produce a nuclear weapon. And that means getting Iran one way or another to the standard that the president set in the now aborted negotiations with Iran, which was that they not have any enrichment capability. As long as they have the ability to enrich uranium to high levels of purity, essentially weapons grade, they have the ability to produce a nuclear weapon at a time of their choosing. Now, there's an underground facility called Fordo, and the real question is, how can that be taken offline? There are three possibilities. One is, as was mentioned, a U.S. strike. The United States has unique capabilities to reach and destroy that very deeply buried target. Another is that perhaps the Israelis have a creative solution. They've shown a lot of ingenuity in this attack and in some of their other attacks against Hezbollah and others. And so perhaps they have a different solution. And the third is that the Iranians, under great pressure because of the success of the Israeli attacks in the first few days, might agree to what they previously said they would not agree to, which was to dismantle that facility.
You know, in one of the options you suggested there that could be on the table is a U.S. strike, a targeted strike. What would that mean for the United States? And of course, we know also President Trump's main support, main base may not be in favor of that. But what is the broader implication of such a move?
First of all, I think the president is giving himself that option. I don't think he's made that decision, but he is putting in place the forces that would be necessary to actually carry out that operation. There's a second aircraft carrier strike group now moving toward the Middle East. There are tanker aircraft, fighter aircraft, other assets getting positioned so that he has that opportunity. Now, it's a big move. Of course, it would be the United States' direct intervention in a war that, as you said, many of the president's supporters may not want to see happen. He ran as a critic of previous Middle East wars and said he wanted to be a president of peace and not a president who got pulled into new wars. Having said that, if there's no alternative to Iran emerging from this war without that capability, it has to be on the table and it has to be something to be considered. So he, of course, would try to signal, I think he already is, to the Iranians that if that's necessary, they must not retaliate against U.S. forces in the Gulf. There's certainly some risk that they would, and that the U.S. forces could then be under attack, and that might pull the United States in further. But so if he's going to do it, he has to do it in a way that demonstrates to the Iranian leadership that the costs they are already paying will be even higher if they decide to retaliate against American forces.
Now, when we're also talking about the situation that is playing out there, removing the United States from the equation and just talking about what's happening on the ground, we certainly know that when the attacks were first launched on Friday, they were very targeted, nuclear facilities, scientists, military as well. And some of the latest news we're reading now is that Israel says that it has killed Iran's new wartime chief of staff and the country's senior military commander. If that in fact is the case, how big of a blow is that to Iran?
Iran has suffered some very severe blows. Israel has struck two very important nuclear facilities already, the Natanz enrichment plant and the Esfahan uranium conversion plant. Those are two elements of the Iranian nuclear enterprise. They have killed a number of IRGC and military leaders, a number of leading nuclear scientists. They have destroyed air defense assets and missile launchers. Nevertheless, Iran has continued to be able to launch ballistic missiles toward Israel. They have killed, I think, 24 civilians and injured many more and destroyed many homes in Israel. So Iran has still some fight left in it, but there's no question that the Iranian leadership is under great stress. They did not expect Israel to be this successful this quickly. I think even the Israelis have exceeded what they had hoped to achieve by day 5 of this war. And it doesn't look good. The Iranian leadership now even has to worry about the Iranian public, much of whom detests this regime because of its brutality and corruption over decades, turning against it in its moment of weakness. So this is a really pivotal moment.
We know also that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not ruled out targeting Iran's supreme leader. And we also know that the U.S. president, there's reports suggesting he vetoed that decision. So can Israel go ahead without Trump's green light on such a mission? And if that was the case, what would the repercussions be?
I don't know if that's accurate, that the Israelis proposed it and that the president rejected it. Perhaps it is. Certainly, there's a strong taboo in international politics against assassination of heads of state. I will say that the supreme leader of Iran has a great deal of blood on his hands, Israeli blood, American blood, Iranian blood, Arab blood. It will be a good day when he leaves power and leaves the scene, however that occurs. But it's certainly possible that the president might indicate to Israel, look, he's already showing his weakness. In fact, there may be a faster way to end this without producing some of the blowback and the downsides of removing or going against the taboo of head of state assassination. So it's not because he's a sympathetic figure, but because it may be not the fastest way to get to the best possible and most stable end to this conflict.
I want to thank you for your thoughts and observations today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That is former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Daniel Shapiro, who joined us from Washington.